Marcus Thompson stood in front of his bedroom mirror adjusting his casual weekend attire, a neat polo shirt and pressed khaki pants. Even on his day off, he carried himself with the quiet confidence that came from 8 years of experience as a federal prosecutor. Today was supposed to be simple, just a quick trip to the courthouse to file some personal property documents. The soft sunlight of the autumn morning greeted him as he pulled his modest Honda Civic into the courthouse parking lot. Marcus had intentionally planned his handling of personal business for a Saturday to avoid the usual weekday rush. As he walked toward the entrance, he felt the change in atmosphere, always a different world. Clad as he was in his everyday formal suit and toting his Justice Department badge at the security checkpoint, Maris observed the subtle shift in expressions from the guard, Officer Pete, who usually greeted him with a peppy "Good morning, Mr. Thompson" every weekday, eyed him now with suspicious scrutiny. A guard's hand rested a little too eagerly on his belt as Marcus passed through the metal detector. "Arms out, sir," the second guard commanded. Despite the detector remaining silent, Marcus complied without complaint, having experienced such random checks before. He maintained his composure as they waved the handheld detector across his body. "For the second time, purpose of your visit?" the guard questioned, holding Marcus' driver's license longer than necessary. "Filing property documents at the clerk's office," Marcus replied calmly, knowing how the guard's eyes darted between his face and the ID photo, as if inconsistencies finally cleared to enter. Marcus walked through the quiet hallways, his footsteps echoing against the marble floors. The courthouse felt different on weekends. Emptier, more imposing. A skeleton crew of staff moved about, the curious glances following him as he passed. Reaching the information desk, Marcus found an elderly clerk he didn't recognize. "Excuse me, I need to tie into the property records division," he said politely. The clerk barely looked up from her crossword puzzle. "Third floor, courtroom 3. They're handling all administrative matters today, due to renovations in the clerk's office." She waved him off with a dismissive hand. Marcus checked his watch. 10:15 a.m. He shouldn't be there longer than 30 minutes, which should give him plenty of time to get to his nephew's noon basketball game. He opted for the stairs instead of taking the elevator. His mind was forward to the basketball game. The third floor felt too quiet. He followed the posted signs to courtroom 3. The heavy wooden doors creaked as he pushed them open. The sound echoed through the nearly empty chamber. His surprise was that a small court session did, in fact, appear to be in progress. Judge William Barrett, a man Marcus had heard about but never appeared before, sat on the bench. The judge's steel gray hair and stern expression matched the rumors of his rigid demeanor. Several court staff members were scattered around, along with a few people who appeared to be waiting their turn for various administrative matters. Before Marcus could step back and check if he had the right room, Judge Barrett's sharp voice cut through the air. Well, look who finally decided to grace us with their presence." Marcus opened his mouth to explain his presence, but the judge continued, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Did you think court schedules are merely suggestions that we all wait here at your convenience?" Confusion swept over Marcus as he realized the judge was addressing him as if he were an expected participant in the proceedings. He tried to speak again. "Your Honor, I apologize, but am here for silence." Judge Barrett's gavel cracked against the sound block. "That's enough of your disrespect. We have been waiting since 9 a.m. for case number 2347, and you come in here like you're just out taking an afternoon stroll around the park." The few people in the courtroom turned to stare at Marcus, some with sympathy, others with curiosity. A young court clerk whispered something to her colleague. Both of them watched the scene unfold with wide eyes. Marcus stood perfectly still, his hands relaxed at his sides, his face a mask of professional calm. In his mind, he counted slowly to 10, a technique he had learned long ago for dealing with such situations. He knew what was happening, had seen it before, but this time something felt different. This time, he wasn't just going to let it light. The morning sun streamed through the high courthouse windows, casting long shadows across the courtroom floor as Judge Barrett prepared to deliver what he thought would be a routine scolding to just another tardy defendant. He had no idea he was about to make one of the biggest mistakes of his judicial career. Judge Barrett leaned forward in his high-backed leather chair, his face with each passing second, morning light refined, and caught the silver streaks in his hair as he continued to glare down at Marcus, still perfectly still in the middle of the courtroom. Case number 2347, public disturbance, the judge said much too loud, shuffling through papers he hoped were relevant. Not only are you over an hour late, but you have the audacity to appear in such casual attire. This was a courtroom, not a mall. Marcus took a cautious breath, cooling his voice. Your Honor, if I could just explain. Speak when I tell you to speak. Judge Barrett's voice bounced off the walls of the courtroom. The scattered few in the courtroom squirmed a little uncomfortably in their chairs. A young court reporter rested her fingers on the keyboard. Her eyes moved from the judge to Marcus and back again. The judge continued, his ranciate. I see this type of disrespect altogether too much nowadays. People who think they can just waltz in here on their own schedule, dressed like they are going to a backyard barbecue. He picked up a document from his desk, clearly not even related to Marcus, and waved it in the air. Sarah Chen, a 20-year court clerk veteran, noticed something wasn't quite right. She remembered Marcus from his numerous appearances as a prosecutor, and by the time she could say anything, Judge Barrett was already well into rendering his sentence. $500, he said, his gavel threateningly poised. $500 for contempt of court, to be paid immediately. Perhaps that will teach you the importance of punctuality and proper court etiquette. Marcus' shoulders squared, almost imperceptibly, his jaw clenched. But his voice remained remarkably calm. Your Honor, there seems to be a misunderstanding and not a misunderstanding. Judge Barrett's laugh was sharp and dismissive. The only misunderstanding here is your belief that this court will tolerate such blatant disregard for its procedures. Do you need me to explain what contempt of court means? The condescension in the judge's voice made even the BFF when Sarah Chen had finally found the courage to stand up, a folder clutched to her chest, but the judge waved her away without even looking at her. Your Honor, Marcus cleared his throat, his voice taking on a different cadence that sat several of the court veterans present up straighter. I am Federal Prosecutor Marcus Thompson from the United States Attorney's Office. Am here to file property documents as the clerk's office is under renovation, and not your 9 o'clock a.m. case. The ensuing silence was deafening. Until now, Judge Barrett's face had read as angry. In an instant, it was drained of all color. Gavel, which he had been about to bring down again, stayed frozen. Me there. Sarah Chen quietly sank back into her chair, her hand covering her mouth. You're... For the first time that morning, the judge appeared at a loss for words. He rummaged through his papers in a flurry, hoping to find something that would justify the action. If you check your records, Marcus continued, his voice professional, yet with weight, you'll find that your 9 a.m. case 234-7 already called to reschedule. That message should be on your desk somewhere. Sure enough, buried under the scattered papers on Judge Barrett's desk was a bright pink message slip noting the request to reschedule. The judge stared at it, then back at Marcus, then at the message again. The others in the courtroom had become absolutely still, watching the scene unfold like the witnesses to a slow-motion car crash. The young court reporter had stopped typing entirely, her hands frozen over her keyboard. I'm sorry, Mr. Thompson, Judge Barrett finally managed to say, his voice having lost all its previous authority. There's indeed been a grave error. Yes, Your Honor, there has. Marcus' words were spoken quietly, but they were weighted. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out his Justice Department ID, hoping it up not just for the judge to see but for everyone present to witness. The gold badge caught the morning light, sending a sharp reflection across the courtroom. Judge Barrett cleared his throat, clearly fumbling to compose himself. The contempt charge is of course dismissed. And I would like to extend my most sincere thank you, Your Honor. Marcus cut in evenly. But I think we should talk about this in your chambers, unless you would prefer to continue this discussion here in open court with the recording running. The judge's face had turned even whiter when he fully realized what had just transpired. He nodded hastily and rose from the bench, motioning toward his chamber doors, as Marcus followed the judge toward his chamber's courtroom, silent, tension so thick you could cut it with a knife. The heavy oak door of Judge Barrett's chambers closed behind them with a soft click. The judge's private office was impressive, each wall lined with leather-bound, low books, framed certificates, and one large window that overlooked the COR house garden where fallen autumn leaves danced in the morning breeze. Judge Barrett hurried behind his desk, yanking out his chair, using it as a shield between himself and Marcus. "Mr. Thompson, I cannot begin to express my please sit down, Your Honor," Marcus interrupted quietly, taking one of the leather chairs facing the desk. His tranquil manner drove the intensity up. "We have several things to discuss." The judge sunk into his chair, his usual confidence totally gone. For the first time in his 15 years on the bench, he felt like he was the one on trial. A sheen of perspiration appeared on his forehead as Marcus set his Justice Department credentials on the desk between them. "Let's review what just happened out there." Marcus began, his voice modulated and lucid. "You saw a black man enter your courtroom in casual clothes without asking for his name or checking any documentation. You immediately assumed he was a defendant. Is that a fair assessment?" Judge Barrett shifted uncomfortably. "Mr. Thompson, I assure you race had nothing to do with really." Marcus leaned forward slightly. "So you regularly find white attorneys who enter your courtroom $500 without checking their identity first?" The silence that followed was heavy. Outside, they could hear the faint sounds of people in the hall, not one of whom had a single inkling of the dramatic scene playing out in the judge's chambers. "I have a case file in front of me." Judge Bark tried to explain, his voice weak. "I was expecting a defendant for case number 2347, a case that was rescheduled." Marcus pointed out, "Something you would have known if you had taken even a moment to check your messages or ask for my name. Instead, you made assumptions, dangerous assumptions, Your Honor." Marcus reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thin folder. "What's interesting is that this isn't the first time something like this has happened in your courtroom. I have, in the last month, received several complaints about incidents similar in nature." The color that had been returning to the judge's face suddenly drained away. "Complaints? Yes," Marcus continued, opening the folder. 3 African-American attorneys said they were mistaken for defendants in your courtroom. 2 others reported being asked to prove their bar credentials when their white colleagues were not. All these incidents are now part of an ongoing investigation by the Judicial Conduct Committee. Judge Barrett's hands tightened on the arms of his chair. "An investigation? I wasn't aware you weren't supposed to be," Marcus replied, "but after today's incident, I think we need to address this directly. Your actions in the courtroom weren't just embarrassing, Your Honor, they were a demonstration of the exact kind of systemic bias we're working to eliminate from our justice system." A robin landed on the windowsill outside, its red breast bright against the gray autumn sky. Judge Barrett stared at it, seemingly lost in thought before speaking again. What happens now?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Marcus straightened in his chair. "That depends partly on you, Your Honor. The incident in the courtroom today was recorded. The contempt charge you tried to impose on me is documented. I could file a formal complaint, which, combined with the other incidents we're investigating, would likely lead to a full review of your judicial conduct." The judge's shoulders slumped. 20 years of career achievements suddenly felt very fragile. However, Marcus continued, and more invested in making real change than in pursuing punitive puns. "I want to know what you're gonna do to counter these biases in your courtroom." Judge Barrett looked up, surprise etched upon his face. "You're giving me a chance to fix this." "And giving you a chance to be part of the solution," Marcus corrected him. "But that starts with acknowledging the problem. Those people out there, in your courtroom, they deserve better. Every soul that walks through the door is entitled to leave it with dignity, and respect intact regardless of what they are wearing or what they had on. The judge nodded, slow realization dawning on his face. This wasn't about one mistake on a Saturday morning. This was about a pattern of behavior that needed to change. "What do you suggest?" Judge Barrett finally asked, ready to listen. Marcus reached into his briefcase once more, pulling out another document. "I have some ideas, but first, I want to hear your thoughts on what happened today. Real change starts with honest self-reflection, Your Honor." Beyond the chamber doors, the courthouse went about its quiet Saturday routine, unaware that inside this room, a small yet not insignificant stride toward justice was about to be taken. By Monday morning, news of the Saturday incident had spread through the courthouse like wildfire. It was one of those stories that grew taller with each retelling: how federal prosecutor Marcus Thompson had been mistaken for a defendant, how Judge Barrett tried to find him, and how the whole scene unfolded in front of witnesses. Linda Martinez, a 25-year veteran court reporter, sat amidst a group of eager listeners. "I heard it from Sarah Chin herself," she said, stirring her coffee. "The judge didn't even let Mr. Thompson speak before trying to slack him with that fine. Can you imagine one of our most respected federal prosecutors at a corner table, 3 young law clerks huddled over their phones reading news articles that had already begun appearing on local legal blogs? The headline: Federal Prosecutor Faces Discrimination in Local Court glowed on their screens. Meanwhile, in the U.S. Attorney's office on the 5th floor, Marcus sat in his office, his phone ringing off the hook. His colleague of 5 years, Janet Wong, knocked on his open door. "Marcus, you got to see this," she said, walking in with her tablet. "It's everywhere. The Black Lawyers Association just released a statement in support of you, and they're calling for a full investigation into judicial bias in the county courts." Marcus leaned back in his chair and considered the family photo on his desk, him and his wife at their daughter's college graduation. "This was never just about me, Janet. This was about every person coming in that courthouse being judged based on their appearance and not their character." His office phone rang again. This time, it was the chief judge from the district court requesting a meeting ASAP. What had started as a simple incident at the weekend had spiraled way out of control. Elsewhere, in the same building, Judge Barrett sat in his chambers in solitude, looking down at the messages on his desk, which just seemed to mount. His morning docket had already been reassigned to another judge pending review. Thus far, his secretary, Mrs. Anderson, had fielded calls from 3 different news organizations. The judge picked up one of the messages. This one was from his daughter, a civil rights attorney in Chicago. "Dad, we need to talk." It read simply. He could imagine her disappointment, and it hurt more than any official reprimand could. A knock on his door interrupted his thoughts. It was Robert Chun, the court administrator, looking uncomfortable. "Judge Barrett, the Judicial Conduct Committee has called an emergency meeting for tomorrow morning. They're requesting your presence and all your case records from the past year." In the courthouse lobby, security guard Pete Watson was giving Marcus extra scrutiny just 2 days ago. He watched as a group of protesters began gathering outside. Their signs read, "Raid Justice. Justice should be colorblind and end judicial bias now." Local news vans were starting to arrive, their satellite dishes reaching toward the gray sky. Back in Marcus' office, his phone buzzed with a text from his wife. "You're trending on Twitter, honey. Your daughter says you're her hero again." He smiled, remembering the conversation at breakfast yesterday. How his daughter had asked him once why he was not angrier about what happened. Sometimes, he had told her, the best way to fight injustice is to expose it cool and make people face their own biases. The second time, Janet returned to his office with more news. "Marcus, you won't believe this," she said. 5 more attorneys have come forward with similar stories about Judge Barrett, and not just black attorneys, Hispanic, Canadian lawyers too. "This is bigger than we thought," Marcus nodded, standing up to look out of his window at the growing crowd below. Change never comes easily, Janet, but sometimes it takes one incident to open everyone's eyes. His office phone rang again. This time, it was the State Bar Association inviting him to be a keynote speaker at their forthcoming conference on judicial reform. As he listened to their invitation, Marcus watched more protesters joining the group outside. Among them, he saw several familiar faces, attorneys, court staff, and even some judges. "Afterwards is always the worst part," he said to Janet after he had hung up. "Now the hard work begins, ensuring that it results in not headlines, actual change." Alongside the picture of his family on his desk lay the property documents he had originally come to file that Saturday morning. They now almost seemed insignificant compared to what such a simple errand had set into action. Sometimes, Marcus thought, the biggest changes come out of the most minute moments. Meanwhile, outside, the crowd continued to grow. Their voices rose, calling for justice, calling for change. Inside the courthouse, people went about their business, but nothing truly felt as it once did. Something had shifted like a first crack in a dam, small but significant, promising the possibility of greater change to come. The tension was palpable Thursday morning as 7 senior judges and experts in the legal world sat around a huge oak table in the Judicial Review Board conference room, their faces stoic as they perused the ever-increasing pile of evidence before them. At the head of the table, Chief Judge Patricia Rodriguez shoved a pair of reading glasses farther up the bridge of her nose as she read from the detailed report in front of her. Over the past 3 days, she informed the room, we have received 23 formal complaints about Judge Barrett's conduct. Each case has been carefully documented. She held up a thick folder. What's happening here is not only about last Saturday. Mark Chun, el analista de datos of the court, stepped forward with his laptop. His presentation appeared on the large screen behind him, showing colorful graphs and charts. Nuestra primera análisis de los últimos 3 años de casos del Judge Barrett muestra algunos patterns inquietantes, he explained, pointing to a bar. Minority defendants were given on average 40% higher fines and 35% longer sentences for similar offenses. Whispers immediately filled the room as the board members scanned through the statistics. Judge Rodriguez banged his gavel for silence before proceeding. We also have a complaint from a group of minority attorneys who have expressed grievances against him. Sarah Chin sat fidgety on a chair against the wall as she waited for her turn to testify. She was the court clerk and had been working in the courtroom of Judge Barrett for 5 years. Today, it seemed, were many things she could no longer hold her tongue about. Miss Chun, Judge Rodriguez called. Please relate the board what you've observed. Sarah's hand shook slightly as she stood. Over the past 5 years, I have viewed Judge Barrett to continue to ask minority attorneys to prove their credentials and seldom challenge white attorneys. Last month, he did this a total of 6 different times, where he called the minority attorney and confused them with the defendant in another part of the courthouse. Marcus Thompson sat with the investigation team reviewing security footage from Judge Barrett's courtroom. The team had gathered videos of dozens of cases showing a clear pattern of disparate treatment based on race. Check this one out, said investigator James Martinez, pointing to a screen. Last March, an Asian American attorney was held in contempt for being 5 minutes late, while the previous week a white attorney was 15 minutes late and received only a verbal warning. Marcus made careful notes, his expression professional. We have to make sure we cover all of our bases. He reminded the team this isn't about one judge anymore. This is about identifying and correcting systemic bias in our entire judicial system. Down the hall, Judge Barrett sat alone in a small conference room reviewing his own case history with growing horror. Each file told the same story: unconscious bias affecting his decisions, prejudices he hadn't even realized he held showing up in case after case. His hands shook as he picked up another file. This one showed how he had denied bail to a black defendant for a minor offense while granting it to a white defendant. in an almost identical case the very next day. How did I not see this? He whispered to himself, running his hands through his gray hair. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Dr. Angela Williams, a racial bias expert brought in by the review board. Judge Barrett, she said gently, "Are you ready to begin our session?" Meanwhile, in the courthouse lobby, reporters gathered as more people came forward with their stories. Amanda Torres, a public defender, spoke to a local news crew about her experiences in Judge Barrett's courtroom. It wasn't just the big things, she explained, it was the small things too, the tone of voice, the assumptions where people used to be treated in various ways, based on their appearance within the conference room. Back from review boardroom, Judge Rodriguez closed another folder, addressed her co-meeting members. "This investigation has shown us more than the bias of one judge. It has shown us gaps in our whole system of oversight." She rose, looking around at each board member. "We need new protocols for monitoring judicial conduct, regular bias training for all court personnel, and an efficient system for reporting and addressing discrimination." The investigating team should, having worked late into the evening, their office lights glowed in the darkened courthouse. They knew that their findings would affect not only Judge Barrett's future, but the future of the entire judicial system in their district. Marcus left the courthouse that evening, a thick folder of evidence tucked under his arm, as he walked toward his car. He passed the wall where the motto of the courthouse hung, "Equal Justice Under Law." He permitted himself, for the first time in days, a small smile. Maybe now those words would begin to mean something more. The investigation wasn't the punishment of one judge anymore. It had morphed into a catalyst for taking a closer look at the whole system, forcing everyone to meet head-on some uncomfortable truths about justice in America. It was Friday evening, a week from it all. Judge William Barrett sat on a wooden bench in the garden of the courthouse, observing the way the sun dived into the evening sky and painted its shades of orange and purple. His hands held the manila envelope bearing the preliminary findings of the investigation, and what that had revealed shook him to his core. His mind wandered back to a conversation he had with his daughter Rachel earlier that day. As a civil rights attorney in Chicago, she hadn't held back her thoughts. "Dad," she had said over the phone, her voice firm but caring, "do you remember when I was 12? And you taught me about justice? You said a judge must see with clear eyes and an open heart. What happened to that?" Dad, now sitting in the quiet garden, those words echoed in his mind. He opened the envelope again, though he had already memorized its contents. The statistics were undeniable in that he had given minorities an average of 40% higher fines, questioned the credentials of minority attorneys 27 times more often than their white colleagues, shown consistent patterns of bias and bail decisions in the past 3 years. There was a soft breeze rustling the leaves of the trees in autumn around him. As he remembered concrete cases, there was this young black attorney whom he had mistaken for a defendant last spring, the Hispanic law clerk whom he had questioned if she had any business being in the judge's chambers, and count the small moments of prejudice he never even noticed at the time. The garden door opened and Dr. Angela Williams, the racial bias expert, walked out. She had been working with him all week, helping him understand his unconscious biases. Seeing him alone on the bench, she decided to join him. "Heavy reading?" she asked, gesturing to the envelope. Judge Barrett nodded slowly. "I've been on the bench for 15 years, he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "I always prided myself on being fair, on following the law, but these numbers, the stories, they tell a different story." Dr. Williams sat quietly, letting him continue. "You know what really gets me?" he said, picking up a fallen leaf. "I never saw it all these years. I was so convinced I was being impartial that I couldn't see my own prejudices staring me right in the face." He remembered Monday morning when he finally gathered the courage to watch the security footage of his courtroom. He had seen himself through new eyes, how his tone changed with different people, had his body language shifted, the assumptions he made based on appearance alone. "Recognition is the first step," Dr. Williams replied in a quiet tone. "Many never even make it this far inside the courthouse." The lights were still on in Marcus Thompson's office. The federal prosecutor had just finished reading Judge Barrett's written statement to the review board. In his words there was something surprising, authentic introspection and contrition. Meanwhile, in the garden below, Judge Barrett stood up and walked to a small fountain nearby. His reflection rippled in the water as he spoke again yesterday. He began, "I found an old photo from my first day as a judge and spoke with Dr. Williams. I was so proud, so certain I would be different from the old guard. I would be fair, just unbiased. When did I become exactly what I promised? I wouldn't be a young janitor." Passed by nodding respectfully. Judge Barrett noticed how he automatically tensed up at the sight of the young black man, a reaction he would have denied having just a week ago. "These responses," he said, turning to Dr. Williams, "they're so automatic, I didn't even know I was doing it. That's why they're called unconscious biases," she replied. "But now that you see them, you can change them." The sun had almost set now, casting long shadows across the garden. Judge Barrett thought about all the people who had passed through his courtroom over the years. How many lives have been affected by his unexamined prejudices? How many careers have been made harder because of his assumptions? "My daughter asked me today if I was going to resign," he said quietly. Dr. Williams looked at him thoughtfully. "And what did you tell her?" "I told her I don't know yet, but I do know this: whether I stay on the bench or not, I have work to. This was not just work on myself, but to help others see what I'd been blind to for so long." As the darkness fell over the courthouse garden, Judge Barrett stood up, gathering his papers. Tomorrow would bring more challenges, more revelations, more uncomfortable truths he would have to face. But for the first time in his career, he was truly seeing himself and his role within the justice system with clear eyes. The process for change had begun, not just in the policies of the courthouse, but in the heart and mind of a judge who finally learned to question his own judgments. The main hearing room of the Judicial Review Board was packed on Monday morning. Sunlight flowed from floor to ceiling windows, casting a glow over lines of wood benches holding a sea of lawyers, courtroom staff, and visitors. At the front of the room, 7 members of the board sat in a semicircle at desk. Their faces were somber. Marcus Thompson adjusted his tie, readying himself for testimony. Gone was the angry prosecutor many may have expected to testify, and in his place, the same quiet dignity had carried with him throughout the entire process. In the front row sat his wife Sarah, holding a small notebook where she had been writing down everything since that very first Saturday. Chief Judge Rodriguez brought the hearing to order. The gavel's echo resounded around the hushed room. "Today, we examine the events of Saturday, November 9th, and the subsequent findings of our investigation into judicial conduct here in this courthouse." Camera crews from all the local news stations lined the back wall, their red recording lights blinking steadily. This wasn't just a routine hearing. It was that would alter their judicial district forever. Marcus stood at the podium facing the board, distinguished members. He began, his voice clear and measured. "I'm not here today to seek punishment. I'm here because our system of justice needs healing." He opened a blue folder and began sharing his findings. "Our investigating team has reviewed hundreds of cases over the last 10 days. We found patterns of bias that go far beyond one incident, far beyond one judge." He placed documents on the evidence table one by one. A Hispanic, the lawyer, being asked to show her bar card 3 times in one day. A black defendant being denied bail for the same crime that had a white defendant released. An Asian law clerk being mistaken for the translator at every turn. Each illustration hit with silent power. In the second row, Judge Barrett sat listening, his hands folded in his lap. His daughter Rachel, flown in from Chicago, sat beside him, her hand resting consolingly on his arm. He was different now, chastened and wiser. Marcus kept putting graphs and statistics up on the big screen, "But Harris, what counts?" he said, whirling to face the entire room. Pressed with the discovery of these facts, Judge Barrett did one extraordinary thing. He listened, he learned, he admitted his biases. The room rustled with amazement. This wasn't angry condemnation as many had expected. And then he called the next one to testify, Judge Barrett. He made his way slowly to the podium, looking much older than his 60 years. 10 days ago he started, his voice trembling a little. I thought I was one of the good ones. I felt I treated everybody fairly. I was wrong. He related his process of self-discovery. Through painful epiphanies about his own biases, sleepless nights replaying decisions he had made in the past, and honest conversations with his daughter about justice and privilege. I am not here to justify my actions, he said with conviction. I am here to take responsibility for those actions and, more importantly, to be a part of the solution. Recommendations from racial bias expert Dr. Angela Williams followed. What it is going to take is not just punishment, she said. What we need is systemic change. Continuous bias training for all court personnel. Anonymous reporting systems. For discriminatory behavior, regular review of judicial decisions to uncover patterns of bias. The board members took notes as she outlined a comprehensive plan for reform. This wasn't just about one judge anymore. It was about changing the entire system. Towards the end of the hearing, Marcus made his way back to the podium. Your Honors, he said, addressing each member of the board, we have a choice today. We can view this as an isolated incident and simply move forward, or we can use it as a catalyst for real change. He gestured to the packed room. Look around. Everyone here, judges, attorneys, staff, citizens, we all were part of this system, and we all had a responsibility to make it better. The board deliberated for 2 hours. When they returned, Chief Judge Rodriguez delivered their decision. Judge Barrett would be suspended for 3 months, during which he would undergo intensive bias training. But more importantly, the board adopted all of Dr. Williams' recommended reforms. As people filed out of the hearing room, Marcus felt a hand on his shoulder. It was Judge Barrett. Mr. Thompson, the judge said softly, thank you for making this about change and not vengeance. Marcus nodded. He knew the gravitas of this moment. Sometimes, he said, accountability isn't punishment, it's growth. The reporters waiting outside the courthouse to spill the news had it wrong. The suspension or sanctions were merely headlines. The story was in the quiet conversations now taking place everywhere in the building: bias, justice, how to do better. This was accountability in its truest form, not only to face the consequences, but also to embark on the chance for drastic change. It had been 6 months since that fateful Saturday morning, and the courthouse loomed tall against the spring sky. Its stone steps now proudly displayed fresh flower pots. A small but significant change, a symbol of new beginnings. A different kind of energy buzzed inside the building. Marcus Thompson walked into the main entryway, nodding to Security Officer Pete, who now greeted every visitor with the same respectful smile regardless of what they looked like. It was changes, both little and big, everywhere, and it had finally begun to take shape. Others important, but all relevant today. It was a unique day. Special Judge Barrett was returning to the bench after going through his suspension and training program, but he wasn't going back to the same courthouse had left. The past 6 months had reconstituted the entire system. Marcus stopped by the newly mounted Equal Justice Resource Center on the first floor. The glass wool room hummed with activity as its staff assisted visitors in making their ways through the legal system. On its walls were clear, easy-to-read infographics in multiple languages explaining court procedures and rights. Mr. Thompson called out, Maria Rodriguez, the center's new director. The latest numbers are in. Complaints about discriminatory treatment are down 75% since we implemented the new protocols. Marcus smiled to himself, remembering how hard they'd worked to create these changes. The anonymous reporting system, regular bias training sessions, a monthly review of judicial decisions had all become standard practice. What began with one incident had developed into a revolution within their judicial district. Upstairs, Judge Barrett stood in his chambers adjusting his robe. His daughter Rachel, who had moved back to town to work on judicial reform, helped straighten his collar. The past 6 months had changed him profoundly. The bias training hadn't been easy. Facing his prejudices had meant many uncomfortable moments and sleepless nights. "Ready, Dad?" Rachel asked, seeing his nervous expression. "Different kind of ready," he replied. A better kind. His first case of the day was about to begin. As he entered his courtroom, he noticed the small changes, the new signs clearly playing a recording of defendants' rights in multiple languages, the more diverse court staff members themselves, the bias training certificates proudly framed on the wall. The gallery was full. Many had come to witness this moment, including a number of attorneys who had filed complaints about discriminatory treatment. But they weren't here to criticize, they were here to witness change in action. Sitting on the back row was Marcus, beside Dr. Angela Williams, made permanent bias awareness consultant of the courthouse. They watched as Judge Barrett took his first case, a property dispute between two small business owners. "Notice his language," Dr. Williams whispered to Marcus. "Neutral, respectful, focused on facts rather than assumptions." During the lunch break, the courthouse cafeteria held a special celebration. Judge Rodriguez stood before the crowd of staff, holding up a report. 6 months ago, we faced a crisis, she declared. Today we're becoming a model for other districts. Last week, 3 other courthouses requested our training materials. Judge Barrett stepped up to the podium next. His hands no longer shook as he spoke in public. He had learned to channel his nervousness into determination. 6 months ago, I was the problem, he began honestly. Today am part of the solution. But the real victory isn't my personal growth, it's the change I see in every corner of this building. He gestured to Marcus sitting quietly in the audience. Mr. Thompson could have demanded my resignation instead. He showed all of us that true justice includes the chance to learn and grow. After the gathering, Marcus walked through the courthouse one last time before he headed home. He stopped by the wall where the motto "Equal Justice Under Law" still hung below it. Now there was an addition: "Justice sees with clear eyes and an open heart." His phone buzzed. A message from his daughter. "Dad, my law school professor used your case as an example today. Real change happens one person at a time." Outside, flowers were blooming during spring in the courthouse garden where Judge Barrett had spent so much time reflecting. A group of law students toured the new resource center, faces bright with hope for the future they would help shape. As Marcus drove home that evening, he thought about how one moment of injustice had led to waves of positive change. The courthouse wasn't perfect, no system created by humans ever could be, but it was better. More importantly, it was still improving, still growing, still learning. His wife met him at the door with a smile. "How was it?" she asked. Marcus looked back at the setting sun, thinking of all that had changed in 6 months. "It's not just a resolution," he replied. "It's a new beginning." And in courtrooms and corridors throughout the building, that a new beginning was unfolding, one case, one person, one moment at a time.